Hello folks, Josh Cooper here again. I'm on my second webinar. Thank you for everybody that's expressed interest in my first one. Again, the goal is just to capture some items and some general information, provide some history for folks that are too busy spending time with their families, just to give them some ideas, some more insight on what it is. Again, this is just pulled from historical documents that are made publicly available. This time, I'd like to talk about the history of the growth projects in the 1 to 5 year plan. Basically, the immediate projects, the immediate facilities, the immediate things that need to be accomplished in the next 5 years in order to support the school. Douglas County is growing, more people coming in, means more children, means more schools, just basic idea of that stuff. In the meantime, the Long Range Planning Committee identifies capital needs and presents that to the Board of Education for the review. Just so you know, the Long Range Planning Committee is not the ones that works the funding. They're just the ones that say, hey, here's the list, the laundry list of projects that we need funding. As usual, it's a very, very long, deep, thorough list, and there's only so much amount of funding. But in the meantime, it's still the Board of Education's responsibility to go out and secure that additional funding. That's where taxes, mill levies, blah, 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 all that stuff comes in. All said and done, I just looked at the 6 projects that were presented in this year's Master Capital Plan for 16-17, and I just was like, what is the history on them? All I did is just compare them to the previous Master Capital Plans. This was presented to the Board of Education on June 21st. I do want to note one thing. The financials, which I reported yesterday, were reported on June 9th. So yes, they passed the 16-17 Executive Summary Budget prior to the Long Range Planning Committee presenting their Master Capital Plan. I'll let you deal with that on your own. That said, let's get into the projects. These are the 6 projects that are identified for basically new construction in 1 to 5 years. These are exactly from the slides presented by the Long Range Planning Committee. First off is the Parker Expanded Bus Terminal, as well as a land lease kind of tied into it. An elementary schools in the Meadows area down in Castle Rock. In addition to the Castleview High School, the Parker Early Childhood Center, new ones needed, and that Childhood Center in Castle Rock needs an addition. Just 6 simple projects. As you can see here, they were identified in 2015 and they're also identified in 2016 as need for. So there's a history. These 6 projects have already been identified for 2 years. But what if I told you these projects that needed to be built in the next 1 to 5 years, some of them actually have already been on the list for 5 years. So this is actual copies of the Master Capital Plans. This is the 1670, New Construction for Growth and Cramming. This is all just pulled from the LRPC's recommendations. I've just highlighted in yellow the projects that are sitting there. You can see there's the 5, the bus terminal and maintenance facilities Parker. Those 2 are kind of combined, and just a quick summary of that one. In 15-16, you see those same projects carrying over. Perfectly fine. But in 14-15, 3 years ago, we still have some stuff. The Castleview High School is still on there. The Childhood Centers in Parker, Childhood Centers in Castle Rock are there. The bus terminal is identified in the 6 to 10 year plan, which is good. So that's just showing that's out no longer a longer term system. But then if we go to 13-14, still the same addition of Castleview High School. Still the planning in the east and the west. The Childhood Centers are still on the dockets. And you said, well, that doesn't say exactly, but if you go back to 12-13, you can see it still says in Parker, in Castle Rock, and Castleview. As you can see, some of these projects that have been on the 1 to 5 year list have actually been on the list for 5 years, just off the files that I have. I don't have MCPs that go back before 2012 and 13. So all I did is just summarize that up. If it's in the blue here, that means it's been on the list just for the MCP. That year that it was published, it was on there. So you can see 3 of those projects have been historically listed on there. The elementary school and then the terminal have been there on 3 for their own. So there's been knowledge of these projects saying we need to fund these in 5 years, but they haven't been funded. So I'd also like to throw in another piece of this. Let's look at the history of what has been built in the last 5 years. So if we go back to 2012, the Castleview School Edition, right down here, was identified. The Early Childhood Center in Castle Rock down here was identified. The Parker Early Childhood Center, all identified in 2012 and 13. In the meantime, the new construction has been the American Academy Charter School in Parker, the Aspen View Academy down here in Castle Rock. And those all opened in 2013. Next up is the Parker Bus Terminal, which is identified in 2014-15, as well as the Meadows Area Elementary School down here in Castle Rock, identified in 2015-16. In the meantime, what was built in the last year has been the Global View Academy up here in Parker, and the World Compass Academy down here in Castle Rock. One item of concern is the Meadows, an elementary school. This is where children are within walking distance and items and everything of what they need to do. So necessarily putting a charter school on the south side of Castle Rock doesn't necessarily alleviate the requirements in that neighborhood. So all said and done, let's go back to here. These are the issues that were identified. Now, I'm just bringing this up not to put a political point, but just to say these are the Board of Education members that are listed on the master, the MCPs for all those years, as well as Superintendent Fagan on the bottom. I'll let you draw your own conclusions to it. I will say that in the MCPs for 12-13, 13-14, and 14-15, there were highlights about, hey, we have had funding issues dealing with bonds and all this other stuff, there's a large deficiency in funding. So speaking of, let's actually look at that in a historical value. This is the total capital needs on a history. This is the numbers for the capital project funding is pulled right from that same file there. The summaries on the total capital needs here, the blue line essentially was pulled from the executive summaries, the long range planning committee recommendations on the master control MCP. It's basically the same documents I showed you. I just have to scroll up a little bit. So basically here are the needs. This is the highest one that I've started doing the last 2 years just to give a range of values. And here is the disparity. Here's the funding of what's actually being funded for capital projects and improvements. Again, like I said, these are based just solely off taking numbers on publicly available documents and putting them in a graphical format. I just wanted to provide some insight on how long some of the projects that are identified for the next 5 years that need to happen, some of them have actually already been on the list for 5 years. So please keep that in mind as you go forward in your days and something to just quite think about. Thank you.